Hi, Colin Marshall here, letting you know that you can now read a new essay from my upcoming book, A Los Angeles Primer, each and every week at KCET Departures. For details, visit colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Season 3 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. Your relationship exactly with Argonaut Street?
Argonaut. Well, that's a beautiful question. I'm glad you asked. It shows that you've penetrated my work quite a bit, and I'm very flattered. You know, first of all, it's a relationship with Playa del Rey in general. To me, as a lifelong native Angelino, and when I say lifelong, the emphasis is on the word long. I see Playa del Rey as the one community in LA that is relatively unchanged from even my childhood. You have the feel of the way the planes bank off the runway and head a little bit north right after they clear there. It's like going to Playa del Rey for me is like that Proustian moment, you know, with the tea and Madeleine.
Yes,
I mean, everything comes back for me. And when you go there, and you find the right bar, because there's only a couple, but you will be, not only drinking like a weapons grade martini, but you'll be drinking in 50 years of civic history with people who have that kind of a memory, you know. And so Argonaut, there are so many streets in that part of town that are just well played and well named. And it suggests to me adventure, and yet there's a little bit of the sense of Republican old Rome in it, Republican in the small r sense, I mean, you know, and it's a beautiful name, and the street is so thrillingly short. I happen to live on another one of the streets in LA that are shortest by our maps. You know, St. George is a really short street here. It's another beautiful name, quite frankly, but Argonaut is to me dramatic, evocative of the mix of sand, wind, and sea. And it's one of the most poetically named streets in Los Angeles. And it's virtually an alley, you know? I mean, if it were on a racetrack, it would be a pit stop, you know, but to see the name, the street name there, and to have seen it for like the past 50 odd years, always makes me feel a sense of personal location, like grounded, like almost like I'm in a full lotus, and it bestows a blessing on me. That's a pretty elaborate answer to a pretty small question, but you know, that stuff is important to me. Names of streets here in LA. I don't believe that people are well enough acquainted, if anything, with the degree to which LA is unique because of its streets. You know, for instance, we have all these intersections that are well known throughout the world: Hollywood and Vine, Sunset and Vine. You know, Reiner Banham celebrated the intersection of the 405 and the 10. Yes. You know, what other city has that? You know, we know we know streets in other cities, but we don't really know intersections, and we don't really get a sense of place just by saying the words Fifth Avenue or Champs-Élysées. But we do get a sense of place by saying Hollywood and Vine. And we even do get a sense of place by saying Pico and Sepulveda. So that's an underestimated mystique in the city of LA. And it's a reflection of how the city is really, although I know it was laid out differently, it really is probably the first recognizably great city on the planet that was laid out in a vehicular or a mechanical scale rather than a human one, And I think our celebration of intersections is a reflection or an acknowledgement, even if it's a subconscious one, of that fact that we live in a pretty modern mechanical city, even if it is a pretty old city, even by U.S. standards, founded in 1781 and whatnot. But always this name of the street, they all seemingly give you a chuckle, They all are a little bit of an insider nod. They represent something to nearly everyone who's spent any kind of time here. And that's something to love about Los Angeles, frankly, the surface streets and the way we relate to them.
It is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from Los Feliz, Los Angeles, California, where I'm sitting down with Joseph Mailander. He's or Mailander, actually. Well, there's two possible pronunciations, Mailander, and this gets to the question I'm going to ask. But let me tell you first what he's done. He's spent over 30 years writing fiction and poetry and cultural and political analysis here in Los Angeles. He's gathered together some of the observations he's made on Los Angeles from his robust time in the blogosphere over the past 10 years in a collection called Days Change at Night, Notes from Los Angeles' Decade of Decline, 2003 to 2013. I mentioned Mailander. There's, I just said Los Feliz. You can also say Los Feliz. We've talked about Argonaut, but everyone says Argonaut the same to the extent they talk about that street at all. There's Playa del Rey and Playa del Rey. What's going on with San Pedro? What's going on with the pronunciations here in Los Angeles? You've been here longer than I have. You would know better.
Well, first of all, well done. And secondly, who cares? We make a thing our own either through being sanctimonious in our rectitude or being insistent on our error. And I see these kind of debates in our local mainstream media, and you can't see it, but I'm rolling my eyes. And it drives me crazy because I don't care where the East Side begins or ends. I just think when I see that kind of a debate in a newspaper, what a waste of space. Take a look at what's happening in the city, at City Hall or in some kind of political sphere. And we're arguing about the East Side, what that, I mean, please don't insult me with that argument because there's never going to be a winner, right. But we do need to decide other things that are more important. Whether we should say San Pedro or Costa Mesa or Costa Mesa, there's a whole litany of them, yes. I mean, it is a question that impacts actually. And we've been flip about it, but, if you're running for office in a Latino district, you will definitely add a diacritical mark to your name, whether it naturally has one on your birth certificate or not. Right. And that's a cynical and patronizing idea about how we run our elections here in the city, but it's a very real one, and I've seen it happen time after time. Tom LaBonge, who is my city councilman, says Los Angeles,
Oh, sure. It's rare.
So But so my broader point is, who cares? If we were in France, we would be taking pride in the fact that the words we best love to pronounce are mispronunciations of words we've borrowed from other languages, which is kind of the way I see it too. So I don't want a rule book. I don't want a grammar book when we're discussing any of these things. You know that the nature of the city is to be eclectic. It's not to be rigorous. And let's celebrate our eclecticism. Let's celebrate the idea that we may have 4 million different ways of pronouncing even our city's name.
And I personally care less about where the east side begins and where the west side begins and how to pronounce, whether to pronounce Los Feliz, Los Feliz, then that there are arguments, because, I mean, you've spent time in New York. They don't argue about how to say things or where things are, right?
No, I as a matter of fact, having spent some college years in New York, I remember taking a trip to Brooklyn and hearing that there were 30 different ways to say 30, and every one of them is valid. So who cares about that either? We are not here. Let me put it this way. People don't come to LA because they want to see rules enforced. They don't come here for rigor. They don't come here because we've got some kind of really pro forma way of conducting business or even speaking English or whatever we speak, because we speak so many different languages here. So that's not a selling point for me. Let's get out of that mindset. Stop blowing all the newspaper column inches that we do on saying, well, where does this community begin and that one ends? It's just ridiculous. Let's just let it happen and try to find issues of real significance rather than these issues that are just put forth and before us to duck the issues of significance.
Now, I mentioned your new collection, which listeners can get on Amazon, Days Change at Night, Notes from Los Angeles' Decade of Decline, 2003 to 2013. And, if I read a book with that title and the subtitle, Notes from Los Angeles' Decade of Decline, 1963 to 1973, or 1973 to 1983, 1983 to 1993 even, I would say, those were probably decades of decline. 2003 to 2013, does that make you a contrarian at all, to call that a decade of decline?
Possibly. And, I think that the city has declined in some ways that are invisible to the present residents of the city, but only because those present residents do not have the long view of Los Angeles. And I am very quick to point out, I've done this on a few radio shows even before I visualized the book. The decline I'm talking about is political and it's economic, and it's somewhat social, but it is definitely not cultural. And the whole driving force behind the book was because I remembered living through something like this before. I went away to school. I grew up here, but I went to New York in the late 70s, and that was a city in decline.
The worst era of New York in living memory.
That famous headline, "Ford to City Drop Dead," comes out of that epoch. And I'm always entertained, for instance, whenever I read that LA is a city facing bankruptcy. Well, let me tell you, New York was a city facing bankruptcy. You did not know if a particular bridge was going to be open on a particular day, in that era. You could go and see trash piling up on famous commercial avenues, for a couple weeks because the city was still trying to figure out how to pay the people who collected it. Now that was a city that was in decline, and that was a city facing bankruptcy. But the broader point is, and what I noticed in New York in those years, and what kind of resonates with me today, and what echoes with me, is as a city declines politically and economically, and maybe even socially, what the people do, what the ordinary citizen does in response to that, is to plug into arts and culture. So, ironically, while a city faces political decline, it could flourish culturally. I think we also saw this in Peking of the late 1980s. When the students were protesting, and it was like, it was a time of political decline, unquestionably, for what we now call Beijing. But it was also a time of cultural acceleration, even hyper acceleration. I always am amused to recall, for instance, that the students had only been exposed to Dadaism early in that very year. And by the time they were protesting in Tiananmen Square, they were producing all these great Dadaist types of gestures. And it was a vocabulary that they just had never had before because of China's so-called Cultural Revolution. So that was another city. And we see them throughout, this kind of predicament of political decline but cultural flourishing. Another one would be Pablo Neruda's Valparaiso. This is once the second leading city in South America. Just kind of gets bypassed as a failing port town, but yet produces this magnificent sense of poetry and color and, one of the world's most admirable poets. So it's a two-edged sword, and we're seeing that in LA now too. Now, I don't know the full extent of how much of a cultural renaissance this has been, and that's the upside of it too. But I don't know if it just extends to, like, for instance, all the new yoga studios and the food trucks, because that's part of cultural too, But as a guy who's mostly written on politics, but also writes on culture, I want to make sure that I'll trying to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes that New York made when it faced its period of decline, and that some of these other cities, because New York, even though it is still a cultural leader, it never truly fixed the corruption in the city. It never truly solved the problem of political decline, and we see it ceaselessly. And we see the fact that it didn't punishing New York, the New York experience, decade after decade, even now.
In some sense, you see Bloomberg as no better than Villaraigosa, then?
Yes. Well, there's a key difference between them, but it's not much of a difference. Bloomberg is a billionaire, and Villaraigosa is run by one. So there's not a lot of difference between the two. Both of them have made very similar kind of mistakes, to the degree that we have the same developers in New York and LA. How is that even possible? But the biggest developers in LA are the biggest developers in New York, And so we have this great street level culture that we've produced, and New York has the exact same thing. All over New York, there's great culture, but it's almost in refutation to what's going on at the political level. And meanwhile, while we do have all this great culture, rents are higher than ever. We're producing, for some reason, both cities are producing more and more rentals, less and less places you can actually own. The city works to punish the very people that have the most fun in it. The people who are young and culturally engaged, and they're living 3 to a room sometimes, and it's just tough for everybody. They're spending their parents' pensions, and that's the degree to which the city's political side is kind of fraudulent. It's very, very easy to take measures that could help people solve that big conundrum in their lives, which is, how do I pay for housing here? In both those cities, and also in San Francisco, and also in Boston. And a few cities where the whole rental market is kind of overly gamed on the side of renters. It would be easy to take remedial planning measures and fix that, especially here in LA, where we still have a lot of potential for urban infill in areas, and where we have a kind of big condo legacy too. I think that the greatest reflection of the political decline of LA has been in our housing market, and to me, it's just been a sin what the politicians have done to LA with their schemes.
I feel like I must fall into that group of people being punished by Los Angeles right now. And I mean, it's true, I don't own a home. I live in an apartment in Koreatown, and, run out of money now and again, but I don't necessarily feel punished by that. Do you think my generation here has maybe gotten complacent, or should we be expecting more than we do expect? I feel like I don't have any expectations to own a home. And you have a cool house here. We're sitting in here. So yeah, would I like to live in such a house? Yes, but I also feel like I wouldn't be up to the task of purchasing or maintaining one. You know what I mean? So what about? I'm 28. I don't know if that's the age of the people getting punished, but how do you see the newest wave of Angelenos, and whether they're handling the city's advantages and disadvantages well or poorly, to your mind?
Well, that's a really good line of inquiry, at least in the context of what I've been writing about for the past decade, because I do remember having a very chilling moment here in the neighborhood, and I've lived in this neighborhood for 22 years. But 10 years ago, I was at this bar, Tangier, which is on Hillhurst here. And I went to some event, and it was like a new bloggers event or something, and I just wanted to meet some people and all that. I always want to meet some people. I never seem to meet the people I want to meet, although I am grateful for the relationships I have, but I do love to go to these kinds of things, and that was when I realized that my life experience in LA was different than a younger person's all of a sudden. And mind you, at that point, I wasn't 56, I was 46 10 years ago, and I heard people talking, writers, bloggers talking to each other and saying, God, when I make enough money, I'm going to move here. I'm going to move to Austin, or I'm going to move to Seattle, or whatever. And it struck me like all of a sudden there was something wrong, because when I was growing up, I moved to this neighborhood 22 years ago, and I said, I want to move over there. And when I was pointing there, It was like a few blocks over, Right. It wasn't Austin. It wasn't Seattle. It wasn't San Francisco. It wasn't somewhere else. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to live in the better part of the neighborhood, And now you would think for a person in similar circumstances that it's like winning a lottery in order to be able to do that. And I describe this in an essay in the book. It's kind of the weepiest, most nostalgic essay of the 63 in the book, where I come to Los Feliz, and by the way, it first appeared in Zocalo, which is a great local publication, and T.A. Frank, who edited the piece, is a superb editor. I just would like to give a shout out to him. But I came to L.A., I came to Los Feliz from another part of L.A., and I moved into a bachelor apartment. Then I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment, by the way, on the same block, just down the street. And then I moved here, a 2-bedroom house about 3/4 of a mile west of where I originally moved. That's been my scope over 22 years. And that was the kind of arc that people of my age expected to experience. So when I was at Tangier that fateful day 10 years ago, and I heard these people, hoping, feeling crushed by the local housing market and hoping to move somewhere else, not Los Angeles, I knew that something was wrong. Or at least to me, to my experience of the city, something was wrong that could be fixed. And that reinforced my idea that I should be writing a little bit more about what I know. I had experienced the city from a few different really good professional and paraprofessional positions up to that point. I'd been a banker, I had been an arts manager, and I had worked for one of the city's biggest law firms. So in all that experience in my work life, I was able to put together a pretty good idea, at least in my mind, of how the city actually worked. And I'd always been interested in politics. I've worked on 2 presidential campaigns. And so I wanted to, I felt like this is the way I could provide the greatest civil service by simply saying what I do know. Now, what I do know is this. If you want to lower rents in a city, you need to have less rentals rather than more rentals. That sounds counterintuitive to what we understand of the market, but it's really not. Because what happens is when you have too few places to own in a city, when to get technical about it, when the owner-occupied ratio to the rental ratio falls under 50%, you start to have an increase in the price of rents. And this is just, if you studied urban planning at a university, you would know this within the first year, So right now, here in Los Angeles, we have 61% of the city is renters, 38% of the city, 38 to 39% is owner-occupied. There are fewer places to own than there are in other cities. In cities like Seattle and Portland and Austin and these places that we think of as maybe, dare I say, more livable cities for most, their ratio is right around 50-50, And L.A., of course, and New York can get away with it because they're cultural destinations. And I don't mind that element of it. I know that all the city planners know that and are aware of that, and they don't mind piling rentals on. But, over the past decade, we have seen so many more rentals added, especially downtown, and a lot of times in sneaky, below the line ways, buildings will be pitched to the city as condos. and they'll end up as rentals. And the developer will blame the market. They'll say, "Oh, it's too soft. We need to make them rentals now, and maybe later they'll be condos." But I think that if we were being honest with ourselves on how to best experience a city and how to make a city livable, rather than how to make a city more cosmopolitan in the most crushing, wickedest sense, we would pay more attention to that single ratio, the owner-occupied to rental ratio. And some of our politics should be driven by that. I don't see that anywhere in the city now, by the way. I don't see a calling for that. And I think it's a tragedy, especially for, people under 40 who used to think, some of them thought, "Oh, I'm going to experience American dream or something." And now they're thinking, "Oh, I just hope to make enough money so I can get out of town." That's terrible.
I myself am not planning on leaving town anytime soon. Certainly not saving up to do it. Quite the opposite. But we all know those people who say that they're saving up to go to the Seattles or the Austins, and so many of them don't go. I see so much lip service here, a lot of lip service paid to, "Oh, Los Angeles is so bad. I've got to leave Los Angeles. This place is terrible." And you can tell with a lot of these people, even they know they don't mean it. Or they just look at their actions. I mean, there's the ratio of complaints about Los Angeles to people voting with their feet is so high. And it's the same in New York, isn't it? I mean, is it the same phenomenon?
The top industry in Hollywood is entertainment. The second top industry is moving and storage. So some people do obviously move. Especially in this part of town. Now, I think, though, when a person says they want to move and actually doesn't, and I don't blame this for this, I say it as a positive thing, but it's because of a willingness to extend their youth, And I've loved extending my youth to this point, and I hope to for a little longer, or if not a lot longer. But there is something to be said about the cultural eclecticism of LA that feels very warm and friendly to us. LA is not known to be a friendly town, but in truth, it's the streets that are kind of friendly. You feel you can feel love of a local institution in a very short time here in LA because of the way the street culture especially connects to you. And that's something that I think that we've done very well in the past 10 years. Like, Hollywood is a two-sided coin. We've built Targets in the past 10 years, and we've built, big box monstrosities. But we also have this magnificent strip along Sunset between, say, Vermont and all the way down to Echo Park, where there's scarcely a chain to be found, we have mom and pop businesses and people's crazy ideas of businesses and, elaborately colored old buildings. And that's something that's been good for the city to have gone through. But that's only one commercial strip. We tend to project our idea of what a city is based on how we experience a commercial strip rather than all the residential experience that we have. And our residential life is ironically 9/10 of what we experience in a city. So LA is at this point kind of cosmetic in that regard. It's got decent commercial strips, and it's got a few deplorable ones too, but it's still not serving, I don't think, especially the young people in an optimal way. I think that desire to or that mentality where you say that you want to get out of town, but yet you never do, is because of the ironic creature comforts that the commercial side provides, And who doesn't want to be hipper than the next person? Hipsters are mocked, but I love them, frankly. And my wife's in fashion, and she has been all her career, and she's had a great career here. This is a great town for fashion. I believe that actually now it's driving the country in a way that New York never could now, because New York has big houses and we have 3,000 small ones, and that's much more dynamism on our side. So I think that these people are the reason they don't leave, even if they say they do or want to. They've simply grown accustomed to our face. They're comfortable with the cosmetic part of the city too, that we experience along the commercial strips and that we experience even through our most banal retail culture. It's friendly.
You mentioned the hipsters, and I, on the way from the subway station here, walked up Vermont on a stretch that is fairly hipster intensive now, you might say, and crossed Hillhurst, which has its share as well, and then crossed a beloved local structure, the Shakespeare Bridge. What's your relationship with that bridge?
I'm an amateur watercolor guy. I'm an amateur everything, actually. And
sometimes the best way to be.
Yeah, in the true sense of the word, because I love a lot of cultural things, and that's what amateur means, love of something, But I've painted that bridge many times. Like if I don't really sell my paintings, but if we have a charity auction, I'll donate a painting to, and it'll typically be of the Shakespeare Bridge, and it'll typically be of the first or only thing that sells, I really think people like that bridge. Of course, the bridge is, and a lot of things around here are in movies. The one that comes to mind is Dead Again, which was mostly filmed in this neighborhood. And we kind of validate things when, we see them in a movie, therefore it's important. That's not the mystique of the Shakespeare Bridge. To me, being a writer, living within, I've always called it a 9-iron. It's a soft 9-iron from here of the Shakespeare Bridge. And there was a time in my life when I reviewed a lot of theater. Okay. So picture this. It's just a personal experience, but I, like you, would walk to the subway from here to take it to the so-called theater district on Santa Monica in Hollywood, and I'd go to a limited equity production. And my journey would start crossing that Shakespeare Bridge on my way to theater, often on my way to Shakespeare,
Yes, indeed.
And it just was like, it was like kind of, have you ever been in a really good sushi restaurant and, first they hand you a hot towel and,
yes.
You're supposed to not only clean your hands with your towel, but it's an indication to change your attitude, right. Change your comportment, because now you're dining.
Right.
And crossing that bridge often as a pedestrian, and I do it probably once every other day, I am automatically cued to that. I am thinking, okay, now I'm leaving my neighborhood. I'm going into the real world. It's time to change my comportment. It's time to plug into everything that's out there rather than plugging into myself, which I do way too well at home. So that's my relationship to the bridge in a nutshell. And thanks for asking.
Oh, and if we move up the scale, on the list of items, on the list of works of architecture with a place in your Los Angeles cultural psychology. If the Shakespeare Bridge is at the small end of the scale, and we go way up to the Disney Concert Hall, what has that place told you about the cultural and political decline or improvement or whatever either of those streams are doing of Los Angeles?
Well, I can't wait to answer this one. I mean, first of all, my decade of decline, for the purposes of the book, is 2000. It starts in 2003, which happens to be the year that the Disney Hall opened. Mm. And I went to a couple of the galas, and I reviewed the Disney Hall for a periodical that doesn't any longer exist, unfortunately. It's called the LA Alternative Press. Bagged a cover, and I was happy to do it. And I was critical. I was very critical of the Disney Hall. But you know something? I had written about the Disney Hall even before it was permitted. I had an article in the Times in 1989. I couldn't believe we were selecting Frank Gehry to do this because I knew it would create a fiasco. And it did. Now, is it a beautiful building from the outside? Yes, it is. Is it sculptural? Most definitely. I can't imagine a building that would knock off Richard Serra any more than it does, and it does it ambitiously, you know. And if you've ever seen Serra talk, he kind of, who like Gehry has spent some time in Bilbao, which is a shipbuilding town, which is kind of where we get the curves from. You know, he might be a little bit bitter at the degree to which Gehry has knocked him off. But my big question is, as a building, does it really work? And, you know, our Philharmonic is spoiled rotten. I mean, not many orchestras, very talented orchestras throughout the country, not many of them have their standalone building. You know, they have to share a more multi-purpose building with the resident ballet company. Now, you could never produce a ballet at the Disney Hall. You know, you could never produce a real opera at the Disney Hall. How much of a civic building is it really? Yet it's on a county lot, which you would hope it would have made to ensure it being a more civic building. There are enormous flaws in the design. For instance, if you and I were to meet there tonight, and we said we were getting there on separate paths, and we said, let's meet at the Disney Hall. Okay, where do you want to meet? You're stumped. You know, you can't think of a place, one locus, you know, where you're going to meet there, because you have all these suggestions of rooms that are really half rooms. And the place is kind of ramp happy. And not only that, it's very bad and disconcerting for musicians, you know, who experience the stage for the first time. I remember Keith Jarrett was there 3 weeks into its opening. And the first thing he said after playing a little number was, I thought the sound was supposed to go from here to there, pointing to the audience. Yes. But instead it's going from there to here, you know, pointing to the stage. And he said he'd never come back, but he did come back. I mean, he said these things publicly.
Right. He's outspoken.
Yeah, of course he is. But, you know, and by the way, I once saw him in San Francisco where it was a final night of a long show. He played about 3 or 4 nights. And the owner of the club had left him a baby bottle on the middle of the keyboard for when he came out on stage.
Yes, oh my God.
So, and anyway, the Disney Hall has a lot of recognizable flaws, but they've been buried because, you know, the Phil is one of our biggest marketing organizations, you know, and it just has tons of money to use for marketing. And, you know, you never read Sved say anything bad about any concert that goes on there. But Christ, and I get into this in the book a little bit, even though I generally stayed away from culture in my book. But I do note how every now and then at the Disney Hall, the fire alarms go off.
Oh, yes.
And when they go off, they basically ruin your evening. I mean, you should at least get a complimentary glass of champagne every time that happens. But you never seem to read about this in print, you know, because the firewall that used to exist between editorial and advertising is so low that now the places where you would read about it just don't critique it nearly adequately enough. The Disney Hall, to me, is a problem that remains to be solved. It's not a perfect structure by any means. The Philharmonic is not a perfect organization by any means. We need to first stop pretending that they are, you know, and that Dudamel's locks are going to carry it, you know, into the future.
I was going to say there's so many banners for the LA Phil around, and almost 100% of the advertising seems to focus on the conductor Gustavo Dudamel's hair. I never quite figured that out.
Yeah, well, you know, that's their, in marketing, you would call it their value proposition. You know, that is the value proposition.
Kind of a weak value proposition if you get down to it.
Well, it's weaker than you may know. I mean, you know, after whatever it was, 15 years of Esapeka, Salonen, you know, he was setting the whole town up programmatically to go in one direction. And it was the direction of the most cutting-edge contemporary music. He wrote a great piece himself at the Millennium, LA Variations, you know. We were at the cutting edge of new music under Salonen. And now this is a guy who's mostly interested in chestnuts. And, you know, I don't mind seeing a Brahms symphony. I like the Brahms symphonies. But it's just not where we were going. We've missed the arc of our own narrative with our present LA Phil. And to me, realistically, unfortunately, also some of the better classical critics have passed away, like Alan Rich and, you know, Martin Bernheimer's getting up there. I think he still writes for the Financial Times, but he was kind of the voice of reason in LA for a very long time. And we don't have anything nearly that solid anymore in our own cultural milieu. So a lot of this is just getting neglected. And, you know, it's turning out to be, you know, the term in New York that's used pejoratively is bridge and tunnel. Yes. You know, the bridge and tunnel people are coming again. Oh no, you know, hide the spoons. But we now have a kind of bridge and tunnel orchestra, you know, here in LA. And God love them. I know some people in the orchestra, and there are great musicians in it. And the assistant conductor, Lionel, is very talented. I would love to see him take over the orchestra in a few years. I said Lionel, it's Lionel. But
pronunciation thing again, I suppose. Yeah.
I mean, he is French. You know, he's going to be a stickler. He's going to have a code book. You know, but I just think that the Phil is often giving us something that we already knew when, say, Andre Previn used to visit or something, and it's not taking us in the direction that we were set up painfully under Salonen to follow or to expect.
Sitting down to read your collection on the decade of Los Angeles' decline, I would think to myself, flipping it open, reading another essay, is it really that bad? You know, is the situation really in such decline? But we talk about the Disney Concert Hall and Grand Avenue, where the hall is. It's a street downtown that has been getting so much money poured into it from higher ups, and I go downtown almost every day, and Grand Avenue is probably the least interesting part of downtown to me, yet it's the focus of so much official public energy and billionaire money. I guess that is a good representation, as good as any, of the out-of-touchness of the leaders, right?
Yeah, exactly. I would agree. When you say bridge and tunnel, that's what I think of in L.A. It's L.A.'s. You don't have to say bridge and tunnel. You can say Grand Avenue.
Right. Their downtown for those folks is Grand, not Traction, for example, just to name another street.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear, Colin, that you get downtown every day. I mean, because downtown is a fascinating place, because any place that grows quickly is a fascinating place, and downtown is certainly one of them. And I think a lot of people from the West Side and the South Bay are still expecting, to drive into downtown and all they're going to see is Midnight Mission or something. But obviously that's not the case anymore, and in truth it never was. Bunker Hill, though, has expanded quite a bit. And there is a problem with Grand Avenue. The problem is that it's been kind of the official street of LA ego, and Eli Broad, who has just contorted that street into some kind of architecturally eclectic, would be putting it mildly, but there's no rhyme or reason on the street anymore. You're going to have look at it in 3 years, you're going to have two oppositional institutions, both of which have been quite substantially scrambled by Broad in the art world, facing each other. You already have a music center standing now increasingly, and I'm proud to say I forecasted this, antipodal to the Disney Hall across the street. The Disney Hall is allegedly part of the music center, but not really when they're staging their own bloody operas in oratorio, and scheduling them on dates that are very near LA Opera dates that are going on in the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. By the way, the LA Opera is a local institution that I much admire. And once again, Eli Broad nearly wrecked it, with the Ring cycle. I mean, they just about busted the bank. They were bailed out of insolvency by some very creative funding involving a county-backed Bank of America-issued bond that never went before the voters, even though it's county property. And this is an organization that has endured, and I think has lots of vitality downtown, but it's in the oldest, most déclassé building on the whole strip, the old Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, where at least if you and I were going to meet, we could say, I'll meet you in front of that statue of Nureyev, or I'll meet you in front of the Lipschitz, and we would be able to actually meet, unlike at the Disney Hall. So you have, this pointless competition among high culture people, or purportedly high culture people, doesn't engage LA street culture at all. As much as I love LA Opera, that doesn't engage street culture of LA either, The Music Center generally does not, except when, the Mark Taper produces something like Culture Clash there or something, But basically you have highbrow, fuddy-duddy culture unfolding along this street that people from Orange County visit, and most people still don't give a damn. On any given night, there's a lot more interesting things to do than go to Mocha. And I submit, when the Broad's new kind of air filter museum opens, we're not going to be overly impressed with that either.
We've mentioned a bit about, well, you said you were at Tangier, at the bar 10 years ago for that bloggers gathering, and these humbler institutions, bars, they have an important place in some of the essays in Days Change at Night. I think also if you go down the Shakespeare Bridge, you'll be on your way to Ye Rustic Inn, a place I've only dared to go in once. It might not be for me, geared toward me, but it's a fascinating bar. And what is your relationship with Ye Rustic Inn?
Oh, for God's sake, it's ceaseless. But this is nowhere in the book because obviously my relationship predates the book, but I've been in the neighborhood a very long time. I want to tell you that was originally the watering hole 25 years ago, 22 years ago when I got here, of people who were working for ABC News, which used to shoot here in the neighborhood at what is now Prospect Studios. That used to be ABC Studios, and then Disney took over ABC and it got muted. But the Rustic has, for instance, at that time, you had expressed some trepidation now, in 2013. Well, I'm here to tell you that 22 years ago, through most of the summer, you could not walk in the front door because the front door was jammed. It was just jammed shut, and nobody fixed it for about 3 months, and you had to know how to enter the back. And they're now, amazingly, they still have a Myrtleburger on the menu. Well, I knew Myrtle. Now, Myrtle hasn't been there for 20 years, but they still have a Myrtleburger going. So, I have a friend who says it's one place where I can dependably go in Los Angeles, and I know I'm going to be anonymous to everybody, and I'm especially going to be anonymous to my profession. No. And, I kind of feel the same way because, to be honest, I was an only child, and I'm friendly, but I'm not overly friendly, and I like being alone. I like a lot being by myself a lot. I mean, I love my wife and I love my friends and all that, but I value my private space too. And to me, the Rustic is kind of like a tomb in that it's a fine and private place, and it's very dark, and you never know what you're going to get on the jukebox. And it has some star power, I mean, Kiefer used to hang out there and all that, but that was never the reason why anybody would go there. They'd go there in the way that, somebody from Madison, Wisconsin would go to their local bar, and that's basically what it is, a local bar where not everybody, but nobody knows your name, which is the appeal, the biggest appeal for me of bars in LA in general.
Because in your formulation, as a city's political decline sets in, a cultural, if not explosion, then at least the culture might ramp up. It's not wholly bad, or maybe not bad at all, living in a city in political decline, is it?
No, it's not, but I would submit that in upcoming years, it will be much more comfortable for us if we do begin to tackle some of the political problems. Just to give an example, famously, a deplorable amount of people vote in any kind of municipal race. Under 20% recently, that's not democracy by any stretch of the imagination. And the thing is, our people who are in political positions who are all handsomely rewarded. I mean, you probably remember this Maywood scandal at the Times. The whole time that was unfolding, I was thinking, where is Maywood? I've been here 56 years. I don't think I could find it with GPS. Maywood, thank you. Yeah, there are people, there are people all over America who earn too much money, but the Times building is right across the street from City Hall. Yes, who are you kidding with Maywood? Maywood's like a red herring compared to what's going on in this city, of 4 million people. So let's try to balance our books a bit and not try. I think, as I've said before earlier in our talk, that LA in the upcoming teens is a lot like New York in the 70s. And New York was able to skate by culturally, and New York is still a fabulous place. And people in 30 years are going to live in a fabulous place if they live in LA. But it will be way more difficult for them if they don't start solving some of these inherent political problems that we have. Mm-hmm. If we keep having these kinds of city councils that are really politburos, where where whenever there's a motion to do anything, it passes 12-0 or 13-1 or something, and there's no democracy or opposition at all. Or if we have a mayor who is interested only to appoint tactically out-of-towners so that he or she can control them better. Because when you appoint someone like that to head a department and they're from out of town, they don't know anybody here. And basically the mayor's office would get to tell them what to do. I have a lot of respect for a lot of LA's administrators. One of them that I'd like to point out, maybe give some lip service to, is John Kirk Muckery, of the head of the Rec and Parks Department here. I mean, this is like a city unto itself, and he grew up within the system. When I've talked to him, he's been master of all details within the department. He knows the issues. He knows what's going on in his own department. He answers to a very tough commission that often doesn't see things right. And, you can look at shining examples all around, like the Griffith Observatory over there is something that the city can do that's a beautiful thing too, with the right administrator. But administrators at a very, very fundamental level at least have to understand the nature of the city of Los Angeles. And we've had a lot of them in recent years with Villaraigosa because of his because of advice he received, who would be the best way to control some department heads. We've had some out-of-town appointees who really don't understand the stakes or the character of the city, and we need to break with that. City council is going to change it's going to become a very different place, even with the next election. We're going to have to address some profound issues there. We are going to have to settle this economic mess that we're in, although, as I said earlier, I don't think it's nearly as bad as some municipal problems that I've seen previously. But we are going to make LA even better, let's put it that way. We have to be willing to engage the political. And that's got to come from our own sense of civitas. That's got to come from what we understand is the best kind of citizenship. I don't care how people vote, frankly, and nor should people care how I vote. But let's get involved. Let's make sure we understand what issues really are. And I hit upon you with one of them. I think the rental versus owner-occupied thing is a very big one that we should be addressing.
I've been speaking here in Los Feliz, or Los Feliz if you prefer, with Joseph Mailander, or Joseph Mailander if you want to go Germanic, author of Days Change at Night, Notes on Los Angeles' decade of decline, political decline, not cultural, 2003 to 2013. How do you recommend listeners get a hold of this collection?
I recommend they Google my name, however they spell it, and go to Kindle. As a matter of fact, the title "Days Change at Night" comes from X's song "Los Angeles," kind of a seminal moment in LA pop culture. Or Google "Days Change at Night" and buy a Kindle copy. Save yourself a tree. Don't read it start to finish. Read it from any one of the titles that catches your fancy to the next.
Joseph, thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everybody who backed Season 3 on Kickstarter, including Paige Calvert, Jonathan Crow, Douglas Dollars, Paul Doyle, John French, Eric Graham, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Kimberly Hahn, Carl Haley, Stefan Halperin, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovenick, Mark Hines, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Matthew Lickey, Mr. Munvirzi, Rob Montz, Lindsay Muniak, Daniel Murphy, Aidan Noman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Blake Riley, Rob Schultz, Cam Smith, Small Demons, Todd Shimoda, Kevin Smokler, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.